In 1912, American farm households had more telephones than city dwellers. Not because Bell Telephone finally decided rural customers mattered, because farmers had already built their own network using the fencing that surrounded their pastures. By connecting magneto telephones to barbed wire fences, isolated homesteaders created a massive unregulated communication system that at its peak served 3 million people across the American West. More subscribers than the official Bell system, and they did it for free. This is the story of how two inventions, filed 2 years apart at the US Patent Office, combined to solve a problem neither was designed to address: the loneliness of the American frontier. Joseph Glidden received patent on November 24, 1874, for something he called an improvement in wire fences. 2 years later, Alexander Graham Bell transmitted his first telephone message. Within 2 decades, those strands of twisted steel would carry human voices across distances that once took hours to cross on horseback. October 1897. A ranch hand in California cranks the handle of a wooden magneto telephone mounted on the wall of a bunkhouse. 20 miles of barbed wire fence separate him from the main house. The signal travels through steel strands originally strung to keep cattle from wandering into neighboring territory. At the other end, the foreman picks up. There's a grass fire burning toward the eastern pasture. Within minutes, every cowboy on that 50,000-acre spread knows to grab shovels and ride east. The Electrical Review reported that same year on this strange new use for fencing material. On a ranch in California, the journal noted, telephone communication had been established between the various camps by means of barbed wire fences. The article confirmed the technology was spreading across Texas, where vast distances made traditional communication nearly impossible. In Kansas, the New England Journal of Agriculture observed, too, farmers living a mile apart had attached telephone instruments to the barbed wire fence connecting their properties and established easy communication. What began as isolated experiments was becoming something larger, a movement. To understand how barbed wire became America's original social network, you need to understand what the frontier was actually like in the 1880s. Hollywood shows gunfights and cattle drives. The reality was loneliness on a scale modern Americans cannot imagine. A homesteader's claim under the 1862 Homestead Act was 160 acres. That sounds substantial until you realize it meant your nearest neighbor might live miles away. In the Texas Panhandle, the distances stretched even further. Emma Marble, a young woman homesteading in Hidalgo County, Texas in 1899, later recalled the isolation that defined frontier life. Women bore the worst of it. Their role as angels of the home often meant being trapped in cabins or sod houses for weeks at a time while husbands worked distant corners of the property. Historians have documented that many homesteaders suffered from what we would now recognize as clinical depression, brought on by days or weeks of solitude. Some women went months without seeing another human face beyond their immediate family. Mail arrived irregularly. News travelled slowly. Help in emergencies took hours or days to summon. Into this isolation came 2 parallel technological revolutions. The first was barbed wire. Before Glidden's patent, fencing the Great Plains was essentially impossible. Few trees grew on the prairie, making wooden fences prohibitively expensive. Farmers who wanted to construct barriers had to ship lumber by train and wagon from distant forests. The cost per mile made enclosing a 160-acre homestead a financial impossibility for most settlers. Barbed wire changed the economics overnight. Production soared from £10,000 in 1874 to £80.5 million by 1880. Within 6 years, a single invention had increased American fencing capacity by a factor of 8,000. By 1881, an estimated 250,000 miles of barbed wire fences crisscrossed the country. The price dropped from $20 per £100 in 1874 to under $2 by 1897. Suddenly, every farmer could afford to fence their land. The second revolution was the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell received his patent on March 7, 1876. Within a year, he had formed the Bell Telephone Company and began building exchanges in American cities. But Bell and his corporate successors made a calculated decision that would shape telecommunications for the next century. They focused on urban markets. Densely populated cities meant more customers per mile of wire. Rural America, with its scattered populations and vast distances, was deemed unprofitable. The math was brutal. Running copper telephone lines cost roughly $100 to $300 per mile in the 1890s, depending on terrain. A farmer wanting to connect to the nearest town, which might be 20 miles away, faced a bill of $2,000 to $6,000 before he could make his first call. That was the equivalent of several years' income for most homesteaders. Bell Telephone wasn't interested in customers who couldn't afford the infrastructure, so they built their networks in Boston, New York, and Chicago, and left 40% of the American population with no telephone service at all. Then Bell's patents expired. The first patent ran out on March 7, 1893. The second followed on January 30, 1894. What happened next was an explosion of innovation that the Bell monopoly had suppressed for nearly 2 decades. Within 6 years of the patent expiration, over 6,000 independent telephone companies had entered the business. Manufacturers who had been legally barred from producing telephone equipment suddenly flooded the market with affordable magneto telephones. These hand-cranked devices required no external power source, just 2 dry batteries and the mechanical energy of the user's hand to generate a ringing signal. By 1900, farmers could purchase a complete telephone set for about $15 to $25. And here's where the barbed wire comes in. Those farmers already had hundreds of miles of steel wire strung across their properties. They had been maintaining that wire for years, riding fence lines to repair breaks caused by cattle, storms, or simple weathering. The wire was already there, it was already paid for, and steel, while not as conductive as copper, could carry an electrical signal. The technical principle was simple. Iron or steel wire has roughly 6 times the electrical resistance of copper. That meant signals degraded faster over distance, and voice quality suffered compared to proper telephone lines. But for a farmer who just needed to reach neighbours a few miles away, or a rancher who wanted to communicate between distant camps on a single property, barbed wire worked well enough. And well enough was revolutionary when the alternative was no communication at all. The setup required minimal equipment. A smooth wire ran from a telephone mounted inside a house or barn to the nearest barbed wire fence. There it connected to the top strand of the fence, typically with a simple splice. The signal travelled along the barbed wire to another farmhouse, where the process reversed. In some systems, as many as 20 or more telephones connected to a single strand of fence wire, creating what became known as a party line. Party lines meant everyone on the network heard every call. When someone cranked their magneto to ring another household, every telephone on that strand of wire rang simultaneously. To avoid chaos, communities developed distinctive ring codes. The True Ranch in the Texas Panhandle used 2 shorts and a long. Grandma True's ring was a long, a short, and another long. These codes became as personal as signatures. Decades later, former farm families could still recall their childhood ring patterns. The codes also created an unofficial emergency system. When a wheat field fire started or someone was injured, the phone shook with a long continuous ring. Everyone on the line picked up immediately to hear the message. It functioned like a primitive 911, mobilizing dozens of people within minutes. In Montana, the Eastline Telephone Association once summoned 50 men and boys within minutes to locate a lost child, using only a single general ring. Privacy on these lines was essentially non-existent. The theory was that subscribers would answer only when their own ring sounded. The reality was that whenever the bell rang, every woman on the line rushed to a receiver. One neighbour woman who was confined to a wheelchair, Delbert True recalled, was miraculously able to stand when the telephone rang. Secrets were rare. When party invitations went out across the line, uninvited eavesdroppers sometimes showed up as guests. Some subscribers developed countermeasures. Craig Morris, a foreman at the True Ranch, was well known for his profanity. When he cranked out a call, he would wait until everyone on the party line picked up their receivers, then announce loudly that all the old biddies better hang up because he was about to talk about things unsuitable for polite company. The line would go quiet. The network served purposes beyond simple communication. In Hidalgo County, Texas, homesteaders used barbed wire telephones to evade government land inspectors. These officials made frequent trips to ensure settlers were obeying the terms of their homestead claims. There was only one road to travel. As the inspector reached Lordsburg, friends flashed the news over the barbed wire telephone. Women tracked his progress as he moved from farm to farm. He always found the women working at some household task and all surprised as all get out to see him, Emma Marble recalled. The inspector never caught anyone violating the terms of their claim. Entertainment flowed through the wires alongside news and gossip. When someone with a radio received evening broadcasts from Washington with crop reports and weather forecasts, the entire party line could listen in. Musically inclined families would play banjo, piano, or guitar and sing over the line for their neighbors' enjoyment. The operator got everyone to listen, one Texas resident remembered, to the Floyd Boys and others playing music. Reading newspapers aloud became a community service. People no longer had to wait days for news to travel by mail. The technology required constant maintenance. Barbed wire was designed to keep cattle in, not to carry electrical signals. When stapled directly to wooden fence posts, the wire grounded out during rain. Moisture created leakage paths that weakened or destroyed the signal entirely. Early users learned through trial and error that insulation was crucial. The solutions were as creative as they were improvised. Porcelain knobs worked best but cost money. Cowboys discovered that broken whiskey bottles made excellent insulators. Before Prohibition arrived in 1919, every town had at least one saloon, and saloons discarded bottles by the case. Glass is one of the best electrical insulators available. Users would whittle wooden pegs with drilled holes to fit inside broken bottlenecks, then nail the bottles to fence posts with wire strung between them. Other improvised insulators included leather straps folded around wire, snuff bottles, corn cobs, pieces of inner tube wrapped around the wire, and short car tire straps. The same ingenuity that allowed settlers to survive on the frontier allowed them to build communication networks from salvage. Cattle posed an ongoing threat. When a herd broke through a fence line, they severed the telephone connection along with the barrier. In 1886, Telephony magazine described the resulting chaos when cows broke down fence wire and effectively cut off several farms from outside communication. One magazine contributor wrote that he had been prejudiced against fence wire telephone lines ever since, noting that in one particular case, the loss of a human life was attributed to a barbed wire telephone line failing to work. But the lives saved almost certainly outnumbered the lives lost. High-risk pregnancies that once meant gambling on a rider reaching a doctor in time could now be announced instantly. Falls from horses, snake bites, and farming accidents triggered calls for help that would have been impossible a decade earlier. Grass fires that once burned unchecked until they exhausted their fuel could be fought by coordinated crews summoned from miles away. The XIT Ranch in the Texas Panhandle represents the largest documented barbed wire telephone installation. Established in 1882, the XIT was probably the largest fenced range in the world, according to historian J. Evetts Haley. Its barbed wire enclosed over 3 million acres of land across 10 counties. The fence stretched 200 miles from north to south. At the northern end alone, the boundary ran for 162 miles. By 1886, the ranch had 781 miles of fence in place, including a 260-mile west line and a 275-mile east line. Cross fences added by the late 1890s brought the total to 1,500 miles of fencing. In 1888, the XIT connected a telephone line between Tascosa and Alamocitos. By the early 1900s, Haley reported, a great many telephones were placed upon the ranch. Where possible, the top line of the fences was used as a telephone line, though the service was atrocious. The sound quality was terrible, but it allowed quick communication concerning emergencies such as grass fires that required all cowboys immediately. There was even talk among technology enthusiasts of the era that cowboys could carry telephones in their saddlebags and clip onto the fence to report problems wherever they encountered them. The old cowboys, Haley noted, no doubt scoffed at the notion. The XIT's barbed wire network eventually evolved into something more permanent. Today, XIT Communications provides phone service and high-speed internet to rural communities in the footprint of the original ranch and beyond. The fence system became a telecommunications company. The irony would not have been lost on the cowboys who strung that first line. The technical challenges farmers faced went beyond simple signal loss. Bridging gaps in fence lines required creative solutions. When barbed wire fences reached roads, ditches, or property boundaries that didn't connect, farmers had to improvise. Some buried insulated cable underground. Others sank 2 tall poles into the earth and strung them together with lead-covered insulated wire. The materials cost only about $4 for a simple overhead crossing. One technical manual advised that where the wires are looped, connect across a piece of wire and twist tightly on each side, and put more turns on than you think are necessary. Soldering worked best, but most farmers made do with mechanical connections that required periodic tightening. The challenges multiplied during storms. Lightning strikes could destroy telephone equipment instantly. Farmers learned to install lightning arresters, simple devices that grounded dangerous voltage spikes before they reached the telephone. The cost ran about $2 to $3 per installation. Those who skipped this precaution sometimes lost not just their telephone but their house when lightning followed the wire inside. After a few fires, word spread. Lightning protection became standard. The economics of barbed wire telephony created a peculiar inversion of normal telecommunications patterns. In cities, Bell Telephone charged premium rates and extracted maximum profit from customers who had no alternative. In rural areas, farmers operated on a fundamentally different model. The Montana Eastline Telephone Association equipped each of its 8 members for about $25. The package included a telephone set with 2 dry batteries and a Shaw ring condenser, a magneto, a lightning arrestor, a ground rod, knobs, tubes, 10 feet of interior wire, and more than 50 feet of outside drop wire to connect with the nearest pole. Beyond that, one association member explained, "You may use any kind of wire you have. Labour for maintaining the network was supplied by volunteers. The riding of fence lines that ranchers already performed to check their cattle barriers now included checking telephone connections." By 1907, the movement had become a statistical phenomenon. In Oklahoma alone, 715 telephone systems operated with 780 miles of wire and 68 125 telephones. Across 10 Midwestern states, approximately 18,000 cooperatives served 1.5 million rural households. These were not professional telecommunications companies. They were farmers who had banded together to solve a common problem using materials they already owned. The Fort Benton Exchange in Montana illustrates how these networks grew. In 1902, the Butte Intermountain newspaper reported that Fort Benton's latest development is a barbed wire telephone communication. The people of that part of Montana, the article noted, were not particularly happy with barbed wire after decades of fence wars, but they had decided to look at its practical side. They created a telephone exchange that would connect all the ranches to Fort Benton, with the eventual goal of linking every city in the state. What began as a local convenience aspired to become regional infrastructure. Similar patterns emerged across the Great Plains. In Nebraska, farmers extended telephony along section line fences, linking homesteads and small towns before commercial companies appeared in their vicinity. These networks often served as precursors to organized farmers' telephone associations, which eventually issued formal bylaws describing how repairs would be shared and how costs would be divided. The documents reveal a blend of informal local practice and emerging institutional structure. Rural telephony fostered collective problem-solving that commercial firms had never attempted in these regions. The Manitoba Free Press documented similar systems north of the border. Canadian prairie communities adopted practices mirroring those of the American plains, particularly in regions where settlement patterns created the same isolation that plagued American homesteaders. Canadian networks often evolved alongside grain elevator cooperatives and other rural associations that depended on coordinated communication for market timing and transportation logistics. The costs were almost laughably low compared to Bell service. Members of rural telephone associations typically paid $3 to $18 per year for service, compared to the much higher rates charged by commercial telephone companies. Some cooperatives charged no regular fee at all. Members paid only a few dollars annually for routine maintenance and the cost of replacing dry batteries. As one Montana cooperative member explained, ours are private property used for community service. Farm families in some cooperatives paid no regular telephone bills whatsoever. By 1912, the United States Census Bureau documented more than 3,200 rural telephone systems. The U.S. telephone industry included several manufacturers that specialized in the production of rural phones, equipment designed specifically for the farm cooperative market. And here's the statistic that captures the scope of what farmers had accomplished. By 1912, more rural farm homes had telephones than did urban homes. The people who had been abandoned by Bell Telephone had built their own network and surpassed the customers that Bell had prioritized. Iowa led the country in telephones per capita by 1924. The state where barbed wire and corn stretched to every horizon had become the most connected place in America, not because telecommunications companies had invested there, but because farmers had refused to wait for service that was never coming. The barbed wire telephone era began to fade in. The 1920s as formal telephone companies finally extended service to rural areas. The Great Depression accelerated the decline. Poor business practices caused many cooperatives to fail. Subscribers were lax about paying even minimal bills. There were few maintenance people and little regular upkeep of aging facilities. By 1940, fewer farmers had telephones than in 1920. The homemade networks were dying, but they did not die entirely. The Rural Electrification Administration, established in 1935, eventually brought both electricity and professional telephone service to the countryside. By the mid-1970s, more than 90% of American farms had telephone service. Yet some holdouts persisted. As late as the early 1970s, a dairy farmer in Texas still had a barbed wire phone running from his house, a half-mile to the barn. He said it was good for talking to his wife about what time supper was, but most of all, he said, "It's free. I don't have to pay Marbell nothing for that phone, and I enjoy thinking that it's a burr in their saddle." The phrase captures something essential about what the barbed wire telephone movement represented. It was not just about communication. It was about independence, about refusing to accept that corporate indifference should determine who got access to transformative technology, about turning the materials of control, the fences that divided land and marked boundaries, into tools of connection. A 1942 Calgary Herald article observed that it would be a brave government indeed that would dare take a barbed wire phone away from the farm women who have enjoyed this convenience. The writer understood something that telecommunications executives had missed for decades. The telephone wasn't just a business tool for commodity pricing and weather reports. For isolated women trapped on remote homesteads, it was a lifeline to sanity. The party line, with all its lack of privacy, was infinitely preferable to the silence that had defined Frontier, life for generations. Emma Marble remembered it simply. News and gossip were common property, like the sunlight, and we never had any privacies when we went to the telephone. That warmth must have seemed as welcome as the sun's rays, particularly for women whose role as angels of the home had often meant imprisonment in cabins or sod houses far from any other human contact. The barbed wire telephone was never an elegant solution. The sound quality was poor. The lines failed in bad weather. Cattle broke them regularly. Privacy was impossible. The technology was obsolete almost from the moment it appeared, and yet, for 3 decades, it connected millions of Americans who had been written off as too unprofitable to serve. By 1912, those improvised networks served more subscribers than the Bell system. By 1924, the state most dependent on barbed wire fencing led the nation in telephone connections. The devil's rope, as Native Americans called the barbed wire that had helped push them from their lands, had become something its inventor never imagined. Not just a barrier, but a bridge. The XIT Ranch today is divided into many smaller parcels. Some still encompass 100,000 acres or more. The barbed wire fences remain, maintained and replaced as they have been for 140 years. They no longer carry telephone signals. Fiber optic cables and cellular towers handle that work now. But the principle established by those Texas ranchers and Kansas farmers and Montana homesteaders endures. When established systems refuse to serve a population, that population can build its own. In 1874, Joseph Glidden received a patent for twisted steel wire with pointed barbs. 2 years later, Alexander Graham Bell transmitted the first telephone message. Neither man could have imagined that their inventions would combine to create America's first grassroots communication network. But that's what happened. And for millions of Americans who had been told they didn't matter to the telephone, business, that combination changed everything. The last barbed wire telephones fell silent sometime in the 1970s. The technology lasted almost a century, from the first experimental connections in the 1890s to those final holdouts who refused to pay Marbell on principle. Today, the Devil's Rope Museum in McLean, Texas preserves the history of barbed wire in all its forms. The fence that divided the frontier, the barrier that ended the open range, and the telephone network that connected neighbors who had been separated by miles of empty prairie. Those miles are still there. The prairie still stretches to horizons that seem to curve with the earth. But no one is isolated anymore. The networks that farmers built from fencing material and broken whiskey bottles evolved into the telecommunications infrastructure that serves those communities today. The technology changed. The principle of communities connecting themselves when corporations wouldn't remains exactly the same.